The objective of this lesson is to learn about tuples in Python. What is a tuple? A tuple is a sequence of objects, exactly like a list. When you create a list, it can be changed or modified after creation. For example, you can insert into a list, you can append to a list, or you can pop an element out of a list, and so on. However, after creating a tuple, it cannot be changed, and this is not like a list. Other than modifying or changing a tuple, all other operations that you can do with a list, you can also do with a tuple. For example, you can use indexing, slicing, and all other operations as long as they do not change the tuple. To create a tuple, you can use a pair of parentheses and put some items inside those parentheses and separate them by commas. Or even if you do not use parentheses, when Python encounters comma-separated values, it assumes that you want to create a tuple, and it creates a tuple. So the two examples which are shown here, both of them will create a tuple with 4 items. Accessing tuple elements is the same as a list. You can use square brackets to access tuple elements. The indexing of a tuple is exactly like a list, and it starts from item 0, and then item 1, then 2, and then 3 in this case. To create a tuple which has a single value, you must use a comma after the item, even though there is only one value. For example, if you want to create a tuple which only has one element in it, and that element is a 4, then you have to have a pair of parentheses, put the 4 inside, and then put a comma after it. You can convert a tuple to a list by using the list function. Here's an example. In the first line, I am creating a tuple with 4 elements. In the second line, I am converting that tuple to a list. When I print my tuple and my list, you can see Python shows the result of the 2 print statements. Just notice that when Python shows a tuple, it puts parentheses around it, and if it shows a list, it puts a square brackets around it. We can also convert a list to a tuple. Simply use the function tuple. In this example, in the first line, I'm creating a list with 4 elements. In the second line, I'm converting that list to a tuple. The first print statement shows a list, and the second print statement shows a tuple. These are the things that you should know about tuples. Tuples are immutable. That basically means after you create a tuple, you cannot change any element of it, or you cannot change the tuple. For example, when you create a list, you can insert into a list, or you can append an element to the end of it. However, for tuples, once you created it, that's it, and it stays the same. Second, to create a tuple, you already know that you can use parentheses. Also, tuples can include mixed data types, exactly like lists. That means you can have a mix of integers and floats and strings as elements of a tuple. Tuples are sequences, and the order of items matters, exactly like a list. To refer to tuple items, you use square brackets, exactly like lists. Tuples can be sliced, again, exactly like lists. Every time you slice a tuple, you create a new tuple, and you do not change the original tuple. And last, tuples can include other tuples. Let me go to the Python environment and show you a few examples of tuples and what you can do with it. Let me start by creating a tuple and then printing it, and I'm also printing the type of my tuple to make sure that what type it is. So when I run this program, notice that Python tells me that it is a tuple. How do I know that? Because it is enclosed by 2 parentheses. And also Python tells me that it is a tuple. Next, I'm going to access one of the elements of this tuple x equal to my tuple element with the index of 2, then print my x. This time when I run it, Python prints 6.9, which is your element number 2 of your tuple. Next, let's slice my tuple and show you how the slice works. The slicing in tuple works exactly like a list. So for example, if I say slice the tuple from 0 to 3, that basically means it goes from element 0 to 1 and 2. When I run my program this time, you see the output of my last print, which is the value of x, and it's also a tuple, which is a slice of my tuple. When you slice your tuple, Python creates a new tuple, and your original tuple is not changed. Next, let me convert a tuple to a list. When I print my list, you see that Python creates a list. How do I know it's a list? Because it is enclosed by square brackets. To create a tuple with one item, you have to make sure that you put the item and a comma after it, even though it is a single item. Here, I'm printing my tuple, and I'm also printing the type of my tuple to make sure what type it is. When I run this, you see that it shows tuple with a single item and its type is tuple. If you forget to put this comma after it, let's see what happens. Notice that first of all, since you did not put a comma after it, Python assumes that this is a single integer which is enclosed in parentheses. So there is no tuple. So when you print it, it prints that single integer and also shows that the class of this object is integer. What did you learn in this lesson? You learned about tuples in Python.